I guess coming back to now, how the scholarship exam is run, maybe not much has changed, but maybe some has. What is your opinion?
What I want to say is that the grade 5 scholarship exam cannot be abolished for the reasons I mentioned. And then, in that case, can we not make it a burden for a 10-year-old child?
Yeah.
Made it official that corporal punishment is banned from the school system. Teachers are not equipped to understand the use of AI in modern education with responsibility, with ethics.
Yeah.
So there are lots of gaps. So my constant kind of refrain is that teachers are not prepared, supported, remunerated, looked after to do this important job that they are doing. English medium education was a kind of, let's not touch that. Whereas, of course, their children were being sent to private schools, their children were sent to international schools, or their grandchildren had English education. That's a different matter.
You were the Secretary of Education while our country was going through a civil war. How did you manage that?
Absolutely. That was perhaps the biggest challenge.
Going back to the tsunami, what was managing that crisis like?
The lack of preparedness for emergency education. We didn't piggyback on what the other countries were doing to rapidly address the pandemic situation. I think in that context, Singapore, as much as I admire that country, you can't bring that as a comparison. In one sentence, I would say that the education sector is one of the knottiest, one of the most complicated and complex systems, and one of the most important systems. BALPP is to be the premier institution in the country and hopefully the region, which can offer cutting-edge courses, cutting-edge lessons in leadership coupled to public policy.
Your wealth of experience from the life that you've lived, what advice would you give? Let's start with children.
Not to confine yourself to what's being taught in the classroom. Yes.
All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of our podcast series, Talk with T. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Tara de Mel. She is actually a medical doctor by training. I think that's something a lot of people actually didn't know. And she was initially a senior lecturer at the University of Colombo, but then you transitioned over to education, right? Initially, you were the coordinator of the Presidential Task Force on Education as advisor to the President on social infrastructure. Then you move on to being the secretary to the Ministry of Education, and then your tenure that started in 1996. Sorry, little after 1996, going all the way up in 2005, and currently you are serving as the executive director of the Bandaranaike Academy of Leadership and Public Policy. So that's the formal introduction, that everyone would know. But, for me personally, you have been, a major mentor for us, for MU Labs, from the very beginning. You were there as a supporter for MU Labs. And really, a lot of the things we have here at MU Labs today is, a lot of the successes, a lot of the things that we've achieved has a lot to do with, the support we received. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Tara, for that. And, before we start, anything else you want to add? I know I went on a bit of a spiel, but anything I missed or anything you want me to add?
No, I think you pretty much covered the basics.
Awesome. So I think we'll first start with some personal questions, right?
Sure.
So if we went back in time, right, maybe back to 1995, when you were invited to work in public policy and in governance, you were a medical doctor and you were a lecturer at that time. Let's say we wound back the clock. What would you do? If you could go back in time, would you make a different decision? What would you do?
Well, by about 1995, 1996, I had spent more than 10 years as a teacher, as a senior lecturer in the University of Colombo Medical Faculty.
Yeah.
So university life, in the sense, in terms of being a teacher, where not enough funds for research, not enough abilities to do the kinds of things you learned overseas in the postgraduate period and so on, kind of began to slightly frustrate me, in the sense that the maximum that I wanted to achieve in terms of being an academic could not be achieved. So shall I say that the fire in the belly was beginning to drop around 1994, 1995. At which point I took a sabbatical for 1 year, and I spent that time as the director of the Sri Lanka Foundation Institute, where again the introductions to education policy were discussed there. It's during that time the president, who had just taken office at that time, President Kumaratunga, had invited me again for a year to work on the education policy reforms that she had planned during the initial part of her tenure. So, strictly speaking, I joined the president's office as her advisor for 1 year.
Interesting. Okay.
However, I ended up serving there until November 2005. So
like
the 1 year became that long,
okay.
Because a huge kind of responsibility and tasks began to unfold, as you would probably know by now. So that's the reason why it didn't stop at 1 year.
Interesting. If I may ask, like you were kind of walking a tightrope between science and also policy, right? You came from a background in academia, but then you were sort of the middle woman, I would say, in terms of bridging that science with policy. What was that like? What was that experience?
It was interesting also because during the latter part of my career in the medical faculty, Colombo had launched a series of reforms in medical education. It was the first faculty actually out of all the medical faculties in the country that was embarking upon a very ambitious program of medical education reform. I was part of that committee as well. So all of these things actually formed kind of the background to my being willing to join the president's team at that time to start this nationwide education reform plan, which she already had, because I must mention that by 1996, the National Education Commission, which preceded the new commission in 1996. Every commission lasts for 5 years. So the National Education Commission before 1996 had done a thorough consultative process, going around the island, talking to teachers, talking to principals, talking to parents, on the proposals for education reform. So actually in 1996 when I joined, I also joined the National Education Commission as its vice chair in policy, which I forgot to mention to you. So that NEC actually inherited a wealth of information that the previous NEC had got through this very broad and deep consultative process. So, in fact, the National Education Commission formed a crucial part of the presidential task force that was entrusted with implementing the set of reforms, education reforms that the president had in mind.
Interesting. And also, for me, from a personal standpoint, for me, the 1996 or 2005 era was very important for me as well because 1995 was actually the year I was born. So I'm quite young.
Very young.
And I started my schooling in 2001. And I faced a grade 5 scholarship exam in 2005. And for the next 5 years, I was still in Sri Lanka going through the public education system. So really, the policies, the work that you did actually impacted my personal educational journey as well. And I think anyone who's between the ages of like 20 and 40s really owe a lot to you in terms of, because your policies, your work at that time actually impacted their education and their learning, right? So how does it feel for you personally to impact the learnings, education of so many people in this country?
I think I would say it's a very suboptimal impact. Reason being that if I were to explain, which I can't do in a 1-hour interview, the kind of reforms that were proposed, it's described in a book that I wrote 3 years ago. The reforms were widespread. They went on from the preschool ages right up to grade 13 and beyond. And if those reforms actually were implemented the way it was expected to, the impact would have been terrific. It would have been a phenomenal turnaround because it was very comprehensive. And it was designed by a large number of people, experts of different sectors. Again, I have described this in my book. But unfortunately, in Sri Lanka, politics comes in between education and implementation. I hope that won't happen to the current cycle of reforms that are being proposed. So since those things happened, our reform agenda abruptly had to stop. And in Sri Lanka, once again, when a government changes, when an official changes, the policies change, which is extremely unfortunate. So that's why I say the impact could have been much more significant, much more invasive and long-lasting, but it was not.
Interesting. So sort of moving forward, post 2005 to maybe 2020, I guess, around the pandemic era, like what were you up to then? Like what was that period like for you?
That was a very relaxing period because it was as though I was on a treadmill running from 1996 up to 2005, and then I got off the treadmill and I really didn't know, what had happened because everything slowed down. But it gave me a lot of time, a lot of space for reflection, for meditation, for mindfulness practices, and also to do little bits of volunteer help for various people and persons in different organizations, almost all of them connected to education, apart from the work I was doing with my mindfulness teachers and my coaches. So it was a lovely period. I learned a lot and I grew a lot, I think, mentally, if not otherwise.
Interesting. So if I may ask, like, during that period of reflection, when you reflected back on your work, what was the most, what is the thing that you're most proud of achieving? I
think the fact that I was able to reflect back on the years of working in government and the public sector, which was nearly a 12, 13-year period, and understanding the lessons without much regret and bitterness, and the ability to develop resilience in the face of a multitude of issues, and really to grow and to mature in the thinking process.
Interesting.
And that is something I would urge any reformers, any of those people who are very ambitious, and rightly so, to roll out new changes in a country and a system, to have that reflective ability and the growth, the emotional growth that comes with it.
Interesting. Reflection as an important part of creating change for the future. That's a very, looking at the past to change the future, I guess, something like that. Very interesting. And then I guess 2022 to present era, I guess that's when you, I guess founded and also, is currently the executive director of BALPP. What was that what was that era like?
Yes, that was actually an invitation from the chairperson of the Bandaranaike National Memorial Foundation, because again, it was President Kumaratunga who wanted to fill an existing vacuum, a gap in the country for leadership training and training in public policy, because as you know, Sri Lanka does not have a lot of established institutions doing these subjects, but these are very, very common in other parts of the world, particularly the developed nations. So she invited me to draw up a concept note and to try and articulate her vision into something real, which is what we were doing. I just took it up for a few years, just to set the ball rolling, establish and create this particular institution, where we are hoping to open out as a platform to future leaders, for young people, not so young people, to understand the different types of leadership, particularly that's coupled with ethical governance and sustainability, and also where we would want them to understand Sri Lankan governance, Sri Lankan politics, Sri Lankan leadership in the context of what's happening in the rest of the world.
Very interesting.
South Asia as a case in point. Just very quickly, we saw leadership and governance crises happening in 3 countries almost back to back. 2022 Sri Lanka, 2024 Bangladesh, 2025 Nepal. And in all those 3 situations, we had a breakdown in governance, breakdown in political leadership with serious economic underpinnings. We have so much to learn from that. Actually, we are launching a course where we are going to, a couple of economists are drawing up plans to launch a course on how economic underpinnings and dissatisfaction of Gen Z
Yeah, these are called Gen Z protests,
Gen Z
right?
protests,
Yeah.
which led to these. And uniquely, South Asia comes out
Yeah.
as a lot of lessons, I think, for us to learn.
So going back to BALPP, I think I just want to know, like, what is your vision for BALPP? Like, what do you hope to achieve with that organization?
Yeah. So the vision or what I wish to achieve with BALPP is to be the premier institution in the country and hopefully the region, which can offer cutting-edge courses, cutting-edge lessons in leadership coupled to public policy. And in terms of public policy, we have this huge vacuum once again where development of policy, analysis of policy, how to make policy work, implementation of policy, and the bottlenecks that surround it in countries like ours and how to navigate those challenges. So we would ideally like to see BALPP occupying that position in the country and offering that kind of expertise.
Interesting. So shifting gears a little bit, I was actually reading your book that is Challenges to Change that you wrote, and I think it's a very interesting book. And when I was reading it, a Sinhalese poem came to my mind that is called Tibu Tanaka Sora Saturan Gata Nohena Esana Mana Wat Waturen Vala Nohena Kuapa Unat Raja Matidun Gena Nohena Ugatamana Shilpemai Maturakena. Right? But after reading your book, what I felt was that poem is actually not true, because if you look at the historic education systems of Sri Lanka, the learnings, the education of so many children have been stolen by these exact things, like disaster, whether it's the tsunami disaster or whether that's a pandemic, or for example, blatant corruption, or issues with leadership and issues from political standpoint, and that's derailed a lot of education progress. And it really made me realize how fragile of a system our education system is. What are from your book? What are the major readings that you have? What are the major messages that you want to give out from your book?
Yes. So first of all, I think we have to applaud successive governments for not having abolished the main policy of the CWW Kanangara era, which is to offer free education.
Yeah.
I know free has to be used within inverted commas because I know that education is not actually free because the tuition industry is massive. It's kind of invasive from grade 1 upwards. I know all of that. Yet the governments, whatever said and done, have been investing in education, a fair proportion of the budget and a reasonable proportion as a percentage of the GDP. I know we are one of the lowest spenders on
bottom
education.
10,
we are in the bottom 10, you're absolutely correct, which is very, very unhealthy. I mean, the OECD standards is something like between 4.3 and 4.5% of GDP, if I'm correct. But I think even last year, as a percentage of GDP, we spent something like 1.5%. And from the national budget, it was something between 7 and 8%. I don't think Sri Lanka has ever allocated more than 3.5% as a percentage of GDP. So those are some of the negative points. But like I said, the positive point is we have retained that the philosophy that education is a public good, that the government is obliged to supply education free. So that's the first point. But the second point is in terms of policy. Because when an allocation is made to a particular sector, be it education or health, whatever reforms or whatever policies have to be costed, budgeted, so that we know that this is the amount of money that has to be allocated for implementing the new policies per year, implementing projects per year. But what is unfortunate is that all of the monies that are allocated, small as it may be, are not completely spent at a ministry level. Because I can tell you through personal experience, when you go through, because in June we start preparing the budgets, because the budget is in November, as always. When you look at the expenditures of the previous year, you find there are large chunks of money that have not been spent.
Interesting.
Whereas there are large chunks and large areas where money was needed and couldn't be implemented due to the lack of funds. So a lot of bottlenecks. The education bureaucracy is massive. It's, I think, the second largest ministry in the country, the defense being the first.
Defense, okay.
So those are things that have to be corrected. But having said that, I also applaud the 240,000 teachers who teach with a very meager remuneration at the end of each month, something like 45,000 rupees, I think, as a basic salary. The in-service advisors, the principals, all the provincial and zonal directors, I applaud them for carrying out the massive task with the small amounts of pay that they receive. So in one sentence, I would say that the education sector is one of the knottiest, one of the most complicated and complex systems, and one of the most important systems for national development. And unless education is placed at the center of a national development agenda, I don't think a country can move forward. Case in point, Singapore, of course, it's a smaller country with just 5.5 million people, with a tiny amount of school children. Nevertheless, when Lee Kuan Yew brought out his education policies, he clearly said education has to sit right in the center of the national development agenda. And that's probably why they are where they are now.
Exactly. I think that's something that is something that when I read your book, that was a major underpinning that education should be at the center of the development agenda. However, thinking about the time in which you were the secretary to the Minister of Education, one of the main things that happened was, I guess, the war, right? You were the Secretary of Education while our country was going through a civil war. How did you balance that? On one side, we know that education should be the center of the development agenda, but there was a major existential threat to the country. How did you manage that?
Absolutely. That was perhaps the biggest challenge, because 1996, when we entered this reform program, we were in the middle of the war. And two important provinces were not accessible, literally. So the North and the East, we were always talking about provinces except those two, which was also very unfortunate. Even more unfortunate is, even though they were not directly accessible to us, we were having a lot of dialogue, particularly with those in the North. And I distinctly remember the provincial education authorities, the governor at that time, the chief minister, how interested they were in education.
Interesting.
Sadly, the war was going on. It was hampering all aspects of education delivery. And I remember the president always checking when the allocations were made, whether ample amounts of funding were given to those provinces and those districts. And their enthusiasm spurred us on, despite the fact that there was no way that our teams could directly go there, which we did with the other parts of the country. All the other zones we used to visit as a team. I remember when the primary education reforms were launched in Gampaha in 1999, we used to go at least once a month to monitor what's going on in Gampaha. So that was the challenge. But despite the low amounts of funding that was available, I can confidently say that there was no deprivation of the education budget to those provinces. But the implementation was hampered. For obvious reasons. I mean, when there's a war going on, the difficulties. So that was sad.
So talking about one disruption, let's move to another one. That was a tsunami. I think that was another thing that happened while you were in office. So what was that like? I think sort of in any crisis or any disruption, one thing is, trying to do damage control and sort of manage the current situation. But another important thing could be lessons learned and sort of systems and processes that outlast that crisis and remain to the future. And we see that even in the pandemic as well, right? Like, for example, online education wasn't a thing, but post-pandemic, we still have that in different formats. Going back to the tsunami, what was managing that crisis like, and were there any systems or any learnings that we had that sort of continued beyond that crisis?
Plenty of learnings, in the sense that the lack of preparedness for emergency education. I think that is what really struck me. Tsunami came and went in a flash.
Yeah.
Within like 48 hours, some 318 schools were destroyed in so many districts. And you found that students had no place to go because their houses were destroyed, their schools were destroyed. So that was, I mean, it was a unique kind of situation where, you know, it hit us like a bolt from blue. But what was good about the period is, when I say good within quotes again, the kind of response we got from a variety of sectors, not just NGOs and civil society organizations, but from foreign countries. And it was like within a few weeks, we were able to roll out a plan for reconstructing the damaged schools to a better level and to repair the damages that took place in the lesser affected districts and the zones. So what I'm saying is, whilst on the one hand, we had a tragedy, we also managed to bounce back due to the enormous goodwill that we had. And I still remember, because I was monitoring that situation very closely at the Center for National Operations at that time. And the numbers of people who came to our office purely to offer assistance to rebuild education. Of course, UNICEF played a huge role. So did the other UN agencies. Then we had Save the Children Fund, we had JICA, we had all those other NGOs that came, Plan Sri Lanka, they all came on board. And so that was the tsunami. I think at that point we could have developed a proper concrete plan for education emergencies, which did not happen post-tsunami. Of course, when the pandemic hit, I was not in the ministry or anywhere associated with the government at that time. But there again, the demonstration was lack of preparedness. And to me, because COVID didn't hit only Sri Lanka.
Yes.
The pandemic hit across 195 countries, and so many I think 1.5 billion school children were affected, or something to that effect. What happened there was that we didn't piggyback on what the other countries were doing to rapidly address the pandemic situation. Of course, online learning was a problem, not just for Sri Lanka, for many developing countries and even some developed countries. But they quickly rallied around. They quickly had a plan to address the pandemic. Because the pandemic went on till 2022. I think it was till the middle of 2022, schools were closed. So we didn't respond rapidly enough. We didn't learn lessons rapidly enough. We didn't partner with particularly the UN agencies, once again, to be able to address this. I know, like the state of Kerala, for example, how swiftly the chief minister from Kerala responded. I still remember this article I read where he immediately got down laptops for so many schools, immediately arranged data packages that were affordable. So stuff like that happened in countries around us. I'm not talking of the developed countries like South Korea and Singapore and Japan, which anyway, they had got their act together. That was no problem. But so there was a vacuum. I was monitoring it. I was watching what was going on. And we didn't actually have a plan released about how we were going to address the pandemic in terms of learning and supporting the teachers who were then empowered to start online classes. But they did not have the wherewithal to do it.
Interesting. So talking about garnering support from everywhere, from all different places. I think one thing you mentioned is, we had a lot of support from NGOs, international organizations during the tsunami. And I think, post the, for example, Aragal in Sri Lanka, there is a lot of support that I think Sri Lanka can get. Like, how do you actually go about doing that? How do you garner support from international organizations? Like, how do you do that?
I think the government has to give the signal. The government has to openly give the signal saying we welcome support. We need inputs in terms of policy matters, in terms of implementation, in terms of infrastructure. Because and of course with transparency and due diligence and all of that wrapped around that particular aspect, if the government gives that signal, there'll be enough people wanting to support. But then again, it's up to the government to understand what should be taken on board, what should not be taken on, and why not. So for that, I mean, public-private partnerships is something that I promote heavily. I promoted and I still promote heavily. And if the government has a policy saying, look, we are open and willing to have partnerships with X, Y, and Z, but this is the framework within which we will operate. The party that's offering the help also knows what's in store, how both parties would benefit, because there are lots of very good organizations out there, corporate, NGO, civil society, and other, that bring in a lot to the table and they are wanting to help. I think one of the skills the government has to develop or improve on is how to get that in the best way possible for the country.
Understood. So, so moving from policy to politics, which ideally should be the same thing, but in Sri Lanka, I guess those are two different things. When you were working, what directives did you get from, the president of Sri Lanka, or sort of what directives did you get from the ministry side of things? Like, for example, when I read your book, what I understood was from the president's perspective, there were two aspects that were really important. That was making English education more pervasive, that is giving English education to everyone, and then education for peace building. Anything else, sort of, what was it like sort of working with the president at that time?
Like as a theme was to minimize the disparities and improve access to all. So for example, if one of the main policies was to reintroduce the English medium option, which had been abandoned some years before that. We were very mindful of the necessity to make sure that the accessibility is there for every student. Let me give you a quick example, which I describe in the book. When the policy to initiate English medium instruction in the advanced level classes science medium, there was a reason why science medium, because science teachers, most were graduates, almost all were graduates, came with some form of English experience from the university sector. So in terms of teacher training, the burden was less as opposed to had we introduced it in the arts stream. So before it was introduced, one of the things we wanted to do was to collect some evidence to see how many parents would want their children to learn learn the science subjects in English. So we did a 100-school mini survey. Again, unfortunately, we had to leave out the North and the Eastern provinces because we couldn't go there. But we collected evidence from parents, and I think it was an overwhelming majority of parents who said, yes, we would want our children to get an English medium education in the science subjects. So now it was using that kind of evidence in hand, because I still remember we had to make a presentation to the cabinet at that time and explain how we are going to do this, what was the reason for this, and also what's the methodology for rolling this out to other areas as well. So there was a lot of politics involved because, I mean, as it is with any situation, any government, there are the mischief makers who will want to, throw a spanner into the wheel. So English medium education was a kind of, let's not touch that. Whereas, of course, their children were being sent to private schools, their children were sent to international schools, or their grandchildren had English education. That's a different matter. So, so it was like that. Politics always came into the middle. English medium education was just one instance. But even when we were thinking of introducing it to the primary, and we had by then discussed with a lot of primary schools, and there was a huge demand. One of the classic arguments was that the Constitution of Sri Lanka does not allow English medium education. And here we have hundreds of international and private schools teaching in English. So these were brought out, these were explained on television. And we, like I mentioned earlier, we were handicapped with lack of social media. We had no way of addressing these concerns directly to the people. We had to go through some media agency or a newspaper or a television station. So there was no way to explain that the Constitution did not prohibit it. There was English education happening in the country. So politics came in at every angle, at every juncture it came in. But I think the challenge of a government, the challenge of an administration is also to navigate that. Because after all, if you're a secretary to the ministry or a chairman of a corporation or, holding a position of responsibility, being able to understand the opposition, valid or not, and to be able to navigate those challenges, I think is something, it's part of the job description, I would feel.
Interesting. So, sort of trying to navigate the political requirements, I think that's where even we talked about this, the importance of not just bipartisan agreement, but maybe multi-partisan or omnipartisan agreement, when it comes to education policy. If you take countries like Singapore, they have like a 10-year plan for the education reforms. And I'm pretty sure, that would require, uniform consent for that policy. What sort of mechanisms can a country like Sri Lanka employ to do that? Because even for me, it's very difficult, because we know education is a long-term game. You can't formulate education policies in 4 years, right? Like, how do you do that?
I think in that context, Singapore, as much as I admire that country, you can't bring that as a comparison because their system of governance is different. The ruling party has been the ruling party for the last so many decades. They've not had significant changes in the ruling party. And also they had the most charismatic leader, perhaps, in whole of Asia or sometimes the world, in Lee Kuan Yew, who felt that education cannot be compromised in any way. So I think we can't bring Singapore into comparison for that reason, as much as I admire them, like I said. But what is, I think, important that I reflected on when you asked me what did I do after leaving the ministry, one of the things I reflected upon was the inability for us to legislate the reforms. Had we somehow been able to make the Education Act change in a way to accommodate all these progressive reforms, it would have been very difficult for a government that comes in after that to change it overnight.
Interesting.
But one of the reasons why that legislation was difficult was because the president at that time, her party at that time, just had a one-seat majority in parliament. Whereas a government like now, for example, with such an overwhelming majority and it has political stability, it's gaining economic stability, I think legislating reforms would be something I would advise them to do, because that way, a government goes and another government comes, they can't overnight change it at their whim and fancy. So for me, if I was asked what was one regret, that would be the regret, but that was unavoidable. It was not possible to legislate it. But a country like Sri Lanka in particular needs that kind of legislation, like you said, to go on for 4 or 5 years, ideally 10 years. But then again, I must say that yes, Singapore has a 10-year plan, but then again, they have a curriculum revision cycle of about 3 years. Sri Lanka, at the time I was working, had a cycle of 8 years, which I think is far too long. Look at the way the world is changing at such lightning speed. You know more than me how AI and the technologies have taken over education, as it were. So I don't think we can afford to have an 8-year cycle of curriculum reform. I think 3 years would be comfortable, but I mean, countries like Finland even change before that. So yeah, that's a good thing that we should discuss on at a different forum.
Understood. So moving out of politics and sort of going into the science of education, like I think in your book as well, one thing you mentioned a lot is education research and development, how policy should be connected to evidence-based research. What do you mean by that? What is education R&D? How important was it for you personally during your time when you were working in the ministry, and also post, currently? What is that, and what role does it play?
I think education R&D is pivotal in any policy development, policy analysis, or policy implementation process. That's one of the things we did not have during the time that we were rolling out these reforms. Now, in Sri Lanka, as you know, I mean, there are lots of universities that's doing very good research, but there is no kind of a central point where research on policy is being done in terms of education. So one of the things that I was very keen to set up inside the ministry as like a separate independent objective unit was an R&D unit.
Okay.
To that effect, one of the meetings I had with the then Singapore Education Minister, who is the current president of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I remember visiting him and inviting the Singapore NIE, which, as you know, is a magnificent institution, to send a team of persons to Sri Lanka to help us set up our own small R&D unit, which can, first of all, analyze the evidence that is needed as a prerequisite for a policy declaration. Secondly, how ongoing research can help us understand whether a policy is successful or not. If reversal of policy is needed, at what stage before, impact, the dangers of impact can be seen. So like that, to advise us scientifically on evidence-based policy making, how it should be done, who should do it, and what's the kind of training we have to give people who will be working within the ministry ethos on a continuous basis. So that's what I meant by education R&D.
Interesting. Okay. And sort of coming back onto I think we talked about this, about free education a lot. And Sri Lanka is a country that really boasts this fact that we have free education. However, on the other side, when we look at GDP spending, we spend, we bottom 10, when it comes to education spending as a percentage of GDP. And we also, again, say that we have free education for all children, right? From grade 1 all the way to grade 13. And we have free university access to students. We have free clothes, free textbooks, all of this given. That's on the surface, right? If you peel a layer back and go underneath, what you see is, again, as you said, free doesn't necessarily mean good, right? The quality of the learning that children receive is quite different, right? If we, one aspect is parents compensate financially for this lack, right? On average, parents pay per month from 10,000 to 40,000 rupees on private education on children. If we take the budget and we divide it by the number of citizens or children in Sri Lanka, we spend around 40,000 rupees a month on a child. So that 40,000, and if we take an optimistic number and say parents spend 40,000 extra, that's 80,000 rupees a month on a child. That's around $3,200 a year. But if you take a different country like the US or maybe in Europe, we spend somewhere like $50,000, $25,000 on a child per year. So in terms of actual money that goes into the education experience, that's quite low, right? And that sort of shows in the lack of quality in the education that children receive. Again, as I said, teachers are one of the lowest paid employees. Even university access, although, I think 400,000 children every year are eligible to go into university, but only 40,000, around 10 to 20% is only allowed to go because that's the capacity that we have. So there are a lot of issues in terms of the quality of education that children receive. So thinking about the present, where Sri Lanka is right now, what sort of changes do you think we can make to sort of improve quality for children in terms of the education experience?
I think to answer your question, in a simple sentence, is the teachers in this country are the backbone of the education that a child receives. There's 4.3 million children in the school system, 10,100 schools are taught by 241,000 teachers. Now, unless and until these teachers are remunerated properly, they are kept satisfied, they have to feel proud to do their job. There has to be dignity attached to the teaching profession, like it used to be during our parents' time. So the dignity that's attached to the profession is no more. Teachers are considered, a lot of people go to the teaching profession when they have failed at everything else. So for me, teachers become a huge part of this process of improving quality. Then again, teachers not just have to be paid well and expected to deliver, they need to be supported in terms of academic learning. I mean, we have something like 19 colleges of education, national colleges of education, where teachers every year, I think some 1,200 teachers come from the national colleges. Then we have some nearly 100 teacher training colleges.
Yes.
Then we have also about 30 regional English support centers. So we have a massive infrastructure availability for teacher training. But why is the quality so poor? Why is it that our teachers, if you put a grade 8 teacher in Sri Lanka and put a grade 8 teacher in Singapore or one of those, Australia or one of those countries, you can see the difference. Our teachers don't have access and exposure to what's happening around the world. Our teachers don't have the ability, they are almost all monolingual.
Yes.
Almost all of them are monolingual.
Yes.
You can hardly find a teacher who will be able to have a conversation in English plus the mother tongue. So teachers are not equipped to understand the use of AI in modern education with responsibility, with ethics. So there are lots of gaps. So my constant kind of refrain is that teachers are not prepared, supported, remunerated, looked after to do this important job that they are doing. Because if that layer, which is after all 241,000 public servants out of 1.5 million, I think, a total public sector we have in Sri Lanka, it's not massive. And see, the kind of role they play, one teacher can change the lives of 35 students.
Exactly.
One person can make that change. The teacher is a change agent, which we don't realize or we decide to ignore. So my point is that that is our problem. We don't focus on teachers, and obviously accompanying the teachers would be the 10,000 or 11,000 principals we have in schools. But if that layer is looked after, I think many things will come to place. I mean, basics like even running water on tap. The number of schools that are operating, government schools in this country without water. So how can teachers who are females use the 6 hours or whatever period they have in school effectively if they don't have a proper access to a toilet? So there are lots of issues like that. And that's why I said it's the most complex, most naughtiest problem you can think of in government. But it's the government's job to solve it.
Understood. So coming back to maybe some issues children or parents face. One of the main things is the Grade 5 scholarship exam, right? Even in your book, you wrote quite extensively about it. And back then there were two camps, right? And one was to completely abolish the Grade 5 scholarship exam, and the other one was, I think, to get rid of the second paper, right, in the exam.
Correct.
I guess coming back to now, how the scholarship exam is run, maybe not much has changed, but maybe some has. What is your opinion? Do you think we need something like the GFSE? Do we need to change it in one way or another? What should we do with that?
I don't think Sri Lanka has the luxury of abolishing the Grade 5 scholarship exam now until at a divisional secretariat level or a divisional education level, we have some 320 odd education divisions. Until we have good quality schools in all those areas. Why is it that people break their backs and train their 10-year-old children to face this exam? Because they want to give them a good school. Who is the parent who will want to send the child away to a faraway school if there's a very good school in the neighborhood? So one of the main plans in the reform agenda that we proposed was a series of schools called the Navodaya schools, where we were planning to have at least 2 high-quality schools in every divisional secretariat division for a start. Moving up to making it 4 great schools in every divisional secretariat division and so on. That means that a budgetary allocation will have to be made to the province for this purpose every year. That's all it means, and then of course the people who will implement it coming from the provinces. So what I want to say is that the grade 5 scholarship exam cannot be abolished for the reasons I mentioned. And then in that case, can we not make it a burden for a 10-year-old child?
Yeah, I understand.
Can we make it a simple test where we test that student's reasoning ability to understand a simple problem, to analyze a simple thing, which some countries have such tests. Some people call them aptitude tests, but I don't think that's a correct word. So one of the things we were aiming at was to remove the second paper, which was testing a lot of heavy stuff, particularly targeting the grade 6 syllabus, which is absurd, which I think happens now, to confine it to one paper, make it simple, but phase it out in a way that we have these well-developed schools in parallel, coming up in the villages, so that in a given period, maybe 10 years or 8 years or 6 years or whatever, we are able to phase out the grade 5 scholarship exam.
So the need for the exam is less, and
Parents will not want, if there is a school, would you? If you have a school in your neighborhood, as it were, you wouldn't want to. That's why this 2-kilometer radius for popular schools, because you want children to have access to a good school from where they live. So that is one of the problems Sri Lanka has, that those in the periphery don't have access to good schools, so they gravitate towards the urban, popular elite schools, which are like 60 in number out of a total of so many schools. 10,100.
Yeah, true. So my penultimate question, I think another major problem that we are facing, I think that came out into the media recently as well, that is corporal punishment, right? As in anything, there seems to be some forces that's trying to maintain it. What are those? Why is it still a thing? Why is it still something that teachers, even parents, revert to? And like, how can we sort of get rid of it from our classrooms?
So, like in the third decade of the 21st century, when so many new and humane methods of disciplining children is available in the public domain, experts, psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, child specialists have repeatedly said from across all parts of the globe that there are ways of disciplining children, and I don't like to use the word discipline, but that's what they use. When all of those are available, why we resort to a primitive, ancient way of punishing children, leaving physical scars and, more importantly, emotional scars, which cannot be healed at most times. So this has been, again, a problem that has been going on in Sri Lanka, and I think in some other parts of the world as well. I have a history for this because in 2001 era, 2001 era, we introduced a circular. That was the first time an official document went from the Ministry of Education prohibiting corporal punishment and advising teachers on how to maintain discipline in different ways. And we were quoting the recommendations that were coming from UNICEF and UNESCO and WHO and places like that. But unfortunately, the minister at that time wanted to shelve that circular and not release it because obviously there was pressure from influential school principals and others, particularly those with political affiliations. But on a positive note, in 2004, because the president was then the Minister of Education, we were able to release this circular once more, but with a good set of refinements. And at that point, we made it official that corporal punishment is banned from the school system. But then again, in 2005, when governments changed, the circular was shelved once again. So it's the same old cycle that was repeated. But I know the conversation is back in the public domain, and I was very happy when this government had introduced this bill, the Penal Code Amendment Bill, which specifically mentioned the things I said. Use other methods to discipline children and not use corporal punishment. But now it appears that there is pushback, that there is some kind of succumbing to pressure. I feel the wheel has continuously turned in that direction.
Interesting.
So whether there is hope for Sri Lanka in terms of corporal punishment or otherwise is a good question.
Interesting. Yeah, and again, I think so. In terms of corporal punishment, okay, there seems to be other forces. That's my concern. Like there's research, there's academia that says that's not the way to do it. And again, coming back to our previous conversation, that is about teacher training. If teachers are trained properly or taught methods on how to manage a classroom, I guess, effectively.
Absolutely.
Because I don't even know if that is something that's taught in the teaching colleges in any way. Maybe those can be some things that could also be integrated. Sort of coming back to the last questions, I guess, not just me, a lot of people look up to you, and that could be children, parents, and also teachers, right? So if you could talk to those three parties individually, let's start with children, what advice would you give them? If you have, some child who's going in high school right now, growing up in this rapidly changing world, from your wealth of experience, from the life that you've lived, what advice would you give that child?
A high school student, not to confine yourself to what's being taught in the classroom, because even if the classroom education is suboptimal, you have to find ways of exploring other avenues. Keep your eyes and ears open, learn the English language, whether it is taught in school or not. Because that's the global language, that's the language that will give you access to what's happening around the world. Be up to date with the newer innovations. Don't be trapped in the traditional professions of being a lawyer, being an engineer, being an accountant. The world is massive. It's broadly expanding at a terrific speed. And no student should be in a position to put the blame on the school, put the blame on the class, put the blame on the parents and say, look, I didn't get my due, so therefore I'm this. But there are lots of students, because at the age of 15, 16, 17, today's students are so much more mature than it was during our time. So they know. And if they have the ability to access the internet, which is of course meaning devices as well, that can be a challenge for those who are, not in the affluent circles. Use those facilities, because that's where the global education comes to you. You can understand how AI is influencing education in every aspect, from how a student writes an answer to an exam paper, to how a teacher prepares lesson plans, how a teacher examines a question, and much more. So students, don't confine yourself to what's in this narrow confine of a school and a classroom would be my advice.
Interesting. So now going back to educators, people such as myself, what advice, or even, teachers in school classrooms, what advice would you have for them?
Yes, so given the handicaps that the teachers in the Sri Lankan education system are facing, given the constraints and the massive challenges through which they anyway teach, laudably, I would say give your best to the student, because after all, the student comes to you because the student needs help. Parents expect teachers to give the help to the students, but it's very difficult to advise teachers given the constraints under which they are working. Once again, please do not be monolingual. Learn the second language, access what other teachers are doing in the world. There's so much to learn, and every day on the internet, every day from UNESCO or from UNICEF and all these agencies, there is information out there for teachers. So once again, that means you need internet access, you need device access, and you need the English language to be able to participate in those discussions, be it from Zoom or anywhere else, and learn. Don't just, again, be confined to what your training institute is only giving you.
Understood. And what about for parents, finally?
Parents have to make very sensible decisions about children, because ultimately it's not about competition, getting the best mark in the grade 5 scholarship exam, getting your 10 A's and the 4 A's. I don't believe in that. I know competition is there in our face and students have to face it. but please don't put your children through the pressures and the rigors of having to achieve those massive targets. They have to have their childhood. They must learn to play. They must learn to love school and not hate it. So try to be accommodative, because the world has changed. I was talking about a reform cycle that happened quarter century ago, 25 years ago. The world has changed so much since then. So parents must understand what's happening in the world today and be compassionate, resilient, and very, very empathetic towards the children when they are going to school in this current era.
All right. So I guess in terms of questions, I mean, there's so much more that I wanted to ask. And as I said, I sent you an entire list of questions the other day. You were like, Tulip, this is too long. And again, still I have more questions to ask you now. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, we have to, cut the interview short. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to come over to Mu Labs today. And, again, it was, it is really refreshing to always talk to you, to, pick your brain about, these sort of ideas. So thank you so much, Dr. Tara.
And, thank you. My pleasure.
Awesome. So that brings us to an end to another episode in our podcast series. Again, please, follow Dr. Tara and her work, especially at BALPP, right? And also, have read of her book, and also, looking forward to meeting you again in another installment of our podcast series. So thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day.